In this lecture, we're going to discuss the origins of complex civilizations in a couple of regions that I think are really interesting and don't get discussed enough, at least in American universities. We're going to focus on the Indus River Valley, also known as the Harappan civilization, and ancient China. Now, as with other ancient civilizations that are the focus of this class, these are examples of societies that developed out of Neolithic sedentary farming villages in various parts of the world in the early Holocene after the end of the last ice age, and included the development of social hierarchies and reliance on agricultural staples, and ultimately developed into denser urban settlements where large labor forces were employed to build things like monumental constructions. This process, the establishment of formalized hierarchies and bureaucratic control and laws, standardization in some ways, and ultimately monumental constructions in urban settlements, these things are pretty consistent across the ancient civilizations that we're discussing in this class. But the Indus River Valley in particular, and also ancient China, in addition to fitting these patterns in some ways, actually stand out in some really interesting features. So here you can see a chronology of the development of complex societies in South Asia and Eastern Asia and China. We've already talked about Western Asia or the Near East with the development of complex societies, the first states in Mesopotamia. So we've moved further east and slightly later in time, although as you'll see there were some very early and interesting developments in this part of Asia, in these two parts of Asia. For example, I keep reading of inventions that I thought maybe the Romans had early or some other society had really early, and often there's an earlier example in China. I'm thinking, for instance, of the crossbow, invented in China. Writing, early examples of writing in China. They don't appear to have the earliest, but it's sort of up for debate. So keep an eye on archaeology of these parts of the world that we don't discuss as much in the West. So the Indus River Valley civilization, or Harappa, was located in what is today India and Pakistan, as well as a little bit of Afghanistan, and it may have even stretched into Western China. It's similar to other ancient civilizations we've discussed in Mesopotamia and Egypt in that it was centered along a river valley, but in this case it's possible that irrigation wasn't quite as important, certainly as it was in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Rather, the rivers may have been really significant for communication and travel. One of the main things that sets the Indus River Valley civilization apart from other ancient societies is just how geographically huge it was. Unlike the competing city-states that were never really consolidated in a single polity that you had in Mesopotamia, and also unlike the long unified state society along the Nile River Valley that was long but narrow, in the case of the Indus society, it really stretched over a huge area, 1.3 million square kilometers covered by this society, much larger than other civilizations we've discussed. It's also mysterious in some ways, and we'll discuss that as well in terms of its social organization and the writing that we cannot yet decipher. Major archaeological sites of the Indus River Valley civilization, you can see here these early chiefly centers started around 5,500 years ago, for example at Mehrgarh. Here you can see a plan view of some of the excavations at Mehrgarh. Now this was a site in Pakistan that was occupied between about 6,500 and 2,000 before the Common Era. So it was occupied for 4,500 years, and it's 200 hectares in size, or 400 football fields, but it was not probably occupied all at once. It was rather a series of smaller occupations. Mehrgar and these other Neolithic chiefly sites in what later became the area of the Indus River Valley civilization have a few interesting diagnostic features, these pre-Harappan sites of the late Neolithic. They include flexed burials. You can see a picture here of a burial that's flexed, someone kind of in a fetal position on their side, with, in this case, some offerings of what appear to be dogs. These Neolithic sites in what later became the Indus region also had early domesticates, some of which had been introduced from Mesopotamia or the Fertile Crescent, including domesticated wheat and barley. Later sheep were introduced as well, and I believe in the Indus case we see an independent domestication of cows. Cattle are interesting. They were actually domesticated in multiple parts of the Old World several times independently. It looks as though they were domesticated in the Fertile Crescent area or somewhere near Mesopotamia. They apparently were domesticated here in the Indus in sort of southern Asia, and then they were also domesticated independently in North Africa. So whatever it was about cows, they're a very useful species. They were domesticated multiple times. So we see actual chiefdoms, meaning ascribed social hierarchy with a person born into their rulership status in a noble family by 4000 before the Common Era, 6,000 years ago. We see the establishment of complex chiefdoms by 3000 to 2600 before the Common Era. Complex chiefdoms basically are chiefdoms in which one chiefly center is in charge of other chiefly centers around it. So what's interesting about that is it's starting to show regional coherence, where these different sites with their own rulership are starting to be tied together under a single social hierarchy. That is important because it starts to lead toward the development of complex state-level civilizations. So some of these Neolithic sites were 8 hectares in size, with at a given time, with just a couple thousand people. Now, with the actual development of Indus state-level civilization at 2500 roughly before the Common Era, so about 4,500 years ago, sites increased significantly in size and became truly urban. So we have a few examples of some of the most famous sites. Mohenjo-Daro, 617 acres in size. Harappa, after which this civilization is named, not as big, but still a major site. And then in the film that you will see in your weekly module, I believe that film is about the site of Dolavera, which is another large Harappan settlement. So here we have an example of a Harappan settlement. It looks to me like one that you might see on the Mesopotamian floodplain, in that it's raised up off the ground, what kind of looks like a tell type site, in part because of the erosion of earthen architecture over hundreds of years of occupation. One of the things that makes the Indus River society interesting is that it was, as I mentioned, very large. It covered this huge area of 1.3 million square kilometers, but it was also apparently in long-distance trade and contact with Mesopotamia. This is interesting. In fact, there are some Mesopotamian sites that appear to have neighborhoods where people from the Indus lived in like an ethnic enclave, perhaps to produce craft goods. So it appears that with the coastal Harappan city of Lothal, there was a seaport and a trading center that was in contact with this other parts of the world. This suggests really ancient seafaring, mercantile system. It's very interesting. Here we have a plan view of just the very downtown portion of the site of Mohenjo-Daro, which at its peak was roughly 250 hectares in size, with approximately 40,000 people. This is quite a large ancient site. Mohenjo-Daro is among the most famous of the Harappan settlements. It has a very well laid out, carefully organized urban center. And in fact, this is consistent, and this is one of the pieces of evidence that suggests major coherence and communication in the Indus River Valley civilization. These sites are very well organized, very well laid out, and they're very consistent. A small Harappan site was laid out like a miniature version of a large Harappan site. And here in this plan view, you can see at the center, that little rectangular feature at the center is the famous bath of Mohenjo-Daro that I will show you in a little bit. There's a white line over toward the left. That's actually a covered, basically a flowing water gutter. They had very complex technology. They essentially had flushing toilets, running water. Bathing was somehow ritually involved in the political hierarchy and system of the civilization. These sites were laid out with the baths at the center. They also had citadels, and even the bricks themselves that built these buildings, even the bricks were consistent in their size. Across the entire civilization, there was a standardized size for building bricks. That kind of thing is just not seen in the other civilizations we've discussed. Here's an example of a Mohenjo-Daro street seen from the ground. In many ways, this looks like an alley in a modern city to me. These are well laid out, clean, carefully built, organized, orchestrated cities that really suggest they had dedicated, bureaucratic urban planning. They had a sewer system. They were concerned with things like sanitation. There is even evidence they had basically curbside garbage collection. We're talking about 4,500 years ago. This is very organized for such an ancient civilization. So here you can see an example of one of these gutters. It probably would have been smelly. You'd have raw sewage flowing down these gutters in the street. They were covered in some cases with white capstones so that you wouldn't accidentally step in there. And so it might not have been pleasant, but in these ancient civilizations, things like dysentery were a constant threat in any kind of urban settlement. So the fact that they knew that, and the fact that they were routing the sewage away from the city, flowing the fresh water into the sewage canals to wash the sewer away from the city down these gutters, suggests some pretty sophisticated knowledge of sanitation. Here you can see another image of the sewer system with those white capping stones to protect the gutter. And in general, just a well laid out city with these standardized bricks and so forth. Here's an example of a reconstruction of a Mohenjo-Daro settlement. Now, keep in mind, you can see in the background there the river. This is similar to other societies we've seen in that the river, perhaps more for communication here than for irrigation agriculture, was really significant to the development of this civilization. Here's another reconstruction of a Harappan settlement with the houses as they may have appeared when they were occupied. And you can see as well some of these canals running through the city streets. Now at the core of a Harappan site was a relatively large public structure that has been called a citadel. But these aren't nearly as large as like Egyptian pyramids or Sumerian ziggurats. It's a smaller construction, but nonetheless, these cities are carefully organized with a civic ceremonial core, just as we've seen at the other ancient sites. Part of that civic ceremonial core wasn't just the citadel, which you can see in the background, but also a bath, a large, apparently public bath. These sites, the urban sites as well as the smaller sites, had baths in them. Now, if you were at a smaller Harappan town, you would have a smaller bath, but it appears to be part somehow of the civic ceremonial center. It's right in the downtown. It may have been involved somehow with ritual. It may have been involved with, maybe the ruling group in the community ritually bathed as part of their duties or as part of their rights. It's not clear what the rules were for use. It's not clear if maybe men and women used the bath on different days, or people of different ages could use the bath, or maybe it was just land-holding families, or maybe it was just older men or older women who could use the bath. We don't understand the rules of these baths, but they do appear to be really significant in Harappan political dynamics and possibly ritual dynamics. Here you can see both a plan photograph and a close-up of one of these great baths, and it's really more like a swimming pool. They're large. We're talking about 12-meter long bath, significant size, with what appear to be benches around the edge. So, we don't know how deep these would have had water, but you would come down in here and sit and perhaps practice some kind of ritual bathing. So the Harappan civilization is really interesting. We can see evidence of heterarchy. People had different jobs. Most of the society, as other ancient societies, was made up of farmers. People had to produce the food that, paid for, in a way, all of this urban construction. There were also, herders who had flocks and herds of domesticated animals like cattle and sheep. There was metal work. There were metallurgists. People made pottery. People wove textiles. Someone made uniformly sized and shaped bricks. Someone designed these buildings. Someone planned the urban settlement itself. However, hierarchy is different here. Unlike in Egypt, where the pharaoh was a god and might be buried in a massive pyramid. Unlike in Mesopotamia, where the Mesopotamian king was sort of tied in with the gods and related to the priestly class. In Harappa, we're not sure who was in charge. Differences in status are very modest. People had relatively similar houses. People had relatively similar burials. There are some mysteries related to this. In some cases in houses, hidden caches of wealth have been found, almost as though people were hiding their wealth rather than displaying it. In other cases, in burials, essentially fake jewelry that looked like real jewelry of precious stones was found. So it might have been that in public people would wear fake jewelry in order to look like the higher status people. So somehow some aspect of Harappan civilization appears to have sort of suppressed class hierarchy. So we're really not sure who was in charge. They're enigmatic. They're mysterious. This is unlike how other civilizations were organized in ancient times. One of the other great mysteries is just the uniformity in Harappan culture. Maybe there was tight bureaucratic control among these communities, in part made possible by trade and communication up and down the river system, but they had standardized weights and measures for things. Long before the Romans or the Europeans had standard weights and measures, the Harappans did this. The sites were carefully planned according to grids and walled precincts. There's even some evidence that maybe aspects of more modern Indian society were developing. It's been suggested that there may have been an early caste system where you would be born into an entire social class of weavers, of potters, of brickmakers, of sanitation workers. There has been absorbed residue analysis of pottery demonstrating that some of the vessels contained curry dishes. So in some ways, maybe Indian and Pakistani society was emerging even 4,500 years ago. One of the other mysteries, I think, of Harappan civilization is that there's little evidence for the display of who the rulers were. There's very few images of Harappan people. Here are a couple of famous exceptions. If you Google Harappan society, you're likely to see the priest king statue. That's the name that's been applied, but we don't know, enough about the social organization to be sure that this was a priest king. There's also the bronze dancing girl, which is evidence of metallurgy, and also one of the only very few representations of Harappan people. These standardized weights and measures, which you can see here in these carefully shaped pieces of stone that weighed a given amount and would be put on a tiny balance, are really interesting. I looked this up because I was intrigued. It wasn't until 1824 that the British Empire made a standardized measurement for liquid volume so that if you ordered a pint of beer at one pub, you knew it was going to be the same size as a pint of beer at your favorite pub. That was in 1824. 2500 BC in ancient Harappa, 4,500 years ago, the Harappans had standardized weights and measures. Long before the Romans, millennia before the Europeans. I think this is really interesting. And it may tell us something about the strict control, the tight organization of Harappa. One of the other great mysteries of Harappan society is that they had a writing system, but we can't decipher it. We can't read it. In fact, last I heard, there is a supercomputer that is working on trying to crack Harappan writing to see if there is basically a grammar, if there's a syntax, to try to figure out what the order of it is. There are about 400 symbols. These are used on seals and stamps similar to ancient Mesopotamian cuneiform, but they're also labeled above doorways. In the video that you're going to watch for this week, there's like a doorway sign that's got writing on it. We don't know what this writing means. Is it a reference to kinship and economic specialization? Is putting this above your doorway like saying the weavers live here or the potters live here? We don't know. Other mysteries about Harappa include, how did it collapse? There are a couple of different models for how Harappan civilization came to an end. It didn't last very long. It collapsed after only about 500 years. So Harappan civilization lasted from about 2500 to 2000 BCE, or 4500 to 4000 years ago, and then it just sort of stopped. And we don't really know why. There is a discussion in the Rig Veda, the earliest Sanskrit text from India, of an invasion by an army of Indo-European speaking invaders on horseback. Now I want to emphasize, the Indo-Europeans or the Aryans in this story in the Rig Veda, this doesn't mean white people. This means speakers of Indo-European languages coming in from essentially the steppes of Eurasia on horseback to conquer the region. But the problem with this model is, in the Rig Veda, there's really no dating of this event. It doesn't say when it happened. And there's no good archaeological evidence for a mass invasion of these Aryan invaders. It's not clear that, for example, if they came in and took over the region, there's no evidence of them living there afterwards. There's no evidence of the cities having been sacked. There are some intriguing mysteries. For example, at Mohenjo-Daro, the city where the streets had been swept clean, sewer was washed away from the town, and even trash was collected on the street side. At the end of the Mohenjo-Daro occupation, 36 human bodies were left unburied on the surface. Now, it's not clear that they had signs of injury from violence, but it's very unusual that they wouldn't be buried in a site that was so focused on cleanliness. So that is a mystery. Another model has been proposed by some archaeologists in the 20th century, Dales and Rakes, who argued that there was a great earthquake. There is evidence geologically for a great earthquake, which might have caused flooding of the Indus River itself, disrupting trade by inundating sites like Lothal and so forth, and thus making Harappa vulnerable to invasion. So it may be a combination. Maybe there was a natural disaster, and that was followed by opportunistic invasion. That wouldn't be so different from how Mesopotamian civilization collapsed, but we just don't know. So Harappan civilization is a really fascinating ancient society, and I encourage you to enjoy the video for this week and learn more about it. Now, this is a longer lecture. I recommend that you watch it in 2 sections. So the second ancient society that we're going to talk about is ancient China. Ancient China is lesser known to Western researchers, but that's starting to change. There's better communication between Chinese and American archaeologists now, for example. And there are many early dates in ancient China for inventions that have been attributed traditionally to Western society. So, for example, I raised an example earlier of the crossbow. The crossbow was invented in China centuries before the Romans, about 700 before the Common Era. So here you have a chronology of ancient civilizations in China. Now, there's going to be a fair amount of detail in this lecture about different societies. I am not going to expect you to memorize all of that for the exam. I want you to get a general idea of agriculture and early writing and complex society in China, but not worry too much about the particular dynasties or the particular dates of the dynasties. So early complex society in China, like in other parts of the world that we've discussed, was based initially on the Neolithic domestication of crops that could be exploited and could be used to produce a surplus, which could in turn be expended on things like monumental constructions. In the case of China, we have millet, which was domesticated along the Yellow River or the Wanghe River, and we have rice, domesticated along the Yangtze River Valley. Now, one of the other really fascinating things about ancient China is we have evidence for early writing here. Writing in ancient China developed in a totally different way than it developed in Mesopotamia. If you'll recall, Mesopotamian cuneiform was developed as basically a way to record economic transactions. In the case of ancient China, writing appears to have developed as a part of shamanic ritual, where basically, starting as early as 6500 before the Common Era, turtle carapaces were basically placed in a fire, and then the cracks that appeared on the turtle shell were interpreted by a priest or shaman, and then the interpretations were basically inscribed on the shell as a way to sort of tell the future. This developed over time. We have later full-fledged writing by the Shang Dynasty. We have bamboo strips from the later Warring States period, but it appears to have started with this early shamanic, basically telling of the future. Now, here you can see that in this way, similar to Mesopotamian writing, Chinese writing that we know today, for example, began as pictographic writing. So, for example, look at the modern Chinese standardized script word for horse at the top right of that figure. If you look all the way to the top left, back to the oracle bones from thousands of years BCE, you see that it started as a drawing of a horse and basically evolved over time. Same thing for the sunset, for example. You can see this development of the script that was eventually standardized much later. So there are many different ancient civilizations that have been identified for China, and I'm just going to talk about a few of them today. I want to stress that you don't need to memorize all of these for an exam. And I also should mention that I'm sure to mispronounce some of these. But there are some interesting patterns to talk about for some of these civilizations and some kind of fascinating ways in which we can see modern China emerging. So the first specific civilization to mention is the Longxian culture, which really was sort of at the brink of forming an ancient state between 3000 2000 before the Common Era. So if you think of that in reference to other places like Mesopotamia and the Indus River Valley and Egypt, it's slightly after, but it's also very early in terms of world history. So we see in the Longxian, we see evidence for social inequality, in particular with burials. There are some elite burials with special offerings and so forth, and then larger numbers of medium and low status burials, which is what we would expect from a social hierarchy. One of the really well-known ancient civilizations, and also sort of best documented in terms of archaeological evidence, is the Shang Dynasty. So this is the first widely agreed upon Chinese state-level society. And it's at sites like Anyang where we see some early oracle bones with developing evidence of Chinese writing. So for example, over 100,000 Shang oracle bones have been discovered, and we believe that these were used to do things like tell the future. They might have been used to kind of predict when one should go to war, when one should go on a hunt, agricultural fertility and weather patterns and so forth. And then we also see kind of the emergence after the Shang of writing on other media, including things that are less easy to preserve, such as bamboo slips. And it could be that bamboo slips from earlier periods of Chinese history have existed and simply have been lost to the ravages of time. But when we get to Mesoamerica, pay attention to some interesting similarities between Mesoamerica and Shang Dynasty China because, for example, both societies had what we might call shaman kings, or basically the people in positions of power not only had political power, but were also sort of religious figures as well. So the Shang Dynasty is well known for some really incredible artworks and craft specialization, which if you think back to earlier in the class, that kind of craft specialization, including things like working very difficult, hard jade, working in bronze and doing metallurgy, finely made pottery, and other sort of amazing artistic artifacts, such as you can see here with this, what I believe is a bronze tripod vessel. That kind of craft specialization tends to suggest a complex society with lots of different roles for different members of society. Following the Shang Dynasty, we see a fragmentation of the political system in ancient China. For example, the Western Zhou Dynasty helped to topple the Shang in 1045 BCE, so about 3,000 years ago, through warfare. But then, interestingly, the Zhou followed that up by adopting some aspects of Shang society, including their ritual, parts of their literature and music, and so forth. And so, in a way, the Zhou dynasty kind of flourished in its culture after the conquest of the Shang. The Eastern Zhou dynasty is divided in some cases, in some reports, up into a couple of different periods. The duration of the Eastern Zhou dynasty. So we have the Spring and Autumn Annals, and then also the Warring States period. And I think the Warring States period is aptly named and kind of helps us understand what's going on during this time. Lots of shifts in where capitals are located, different states fighting for power, palace intrigue and murder over succession, and so forth. So think of kind of like a Game of Thrones style period of conflict in ancient China. And it was during this sort of era of strife, of turmoil, that Confucius first arose as a prominent sort of philosopher and political thinker. And one of his main arguments was against this kind of warfare and political intrigue, and sort of pushing for a more unified, kind of peaceful philosophical approach to politics. So one of the well-known aspects of ancient China would be the Great Wall of China. During the Warring States period, defensive walls were common. They were necessary to protect all these different states from one another. But following the unification of China by the Qin Emperor, a great wall was built to protect the empire from invading Mongolians. So this wall, for a period of over 2,000 years, this wall was added onto and extended and so forth to protect the unified growing state. So the Qin dynasty is the first empire in China, and an empire is basically when one state takes over and controls many states. It was a well-organized political entity with 36 different provinces and their own governors, kind of the way our society works with the states. It kept itself protected from the horse tribes of Mongolia through the production and elaboration of the Great Wall. And it had the first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, who has sort of a famous tomb dedicated to him, one of the greatest tombs in the history of all of humankind, with the famous terracotta army. And only a fraction of this tomb has yet been excavated, and actually much of what we know about it is from written records of the time, written records from the Qin dynasty. It's reported that as many as 600,000 workers may have been involved. We don't know the actual numbers. There are other legends, such as the architects were sealed up in the tomb when it was closed so that they couldn't tell the secrets of it. There's lots of stuff still to learn about this tomb. So the tomb of Qin Shi Huangdi, we can see here in this plan map. This is China's first emperor. And looking at this plan map, to me, it actually kind of reminds me of the necropolis of the ancient Egyptians. Rather than like a single burial, it's almost like a subterranean city. It's like a city dedicated to this first emperor. perhaps one of the largest tomb complexes ever made. So famously, the tomb of the first Qin emperor, the first emperor of China, has the great terracotta army with hundreds of life-sized or slightly larger than life pottery soldiers. The soldiers actually have unique individual faces, which suggests to some archaeologists that they were built on actual living models. They were modeled after actual living soldiers of the first emperor. If you look closely at some of these terracotta soldiers, in some cases they have kind of standardized bodies but unique heads, so that the bodies and the heads were put together separately. It's a really incredible construction. It's an incredible feat, this entire tomb. Following the Qin dynasty is the Han dynasty, which, as you can see, goes from about 200 before the Common Era to 200 after the Common Era. And this is an interesting time because even though the first Qin empire sort of gives China its modern name, the Han dynasty in some ways is where we can really see the emergence of modern Chinese culture in some ways. So, for instance, the borders of the Han dynasty are practically those of modern China. Many of the laws and social codes of the Han were based on Confucianism and have still been part of traditional Chinese society up until today. They also had some really incredible bureaucratic and organizational characteristics, such as a parks department, state projects, nationalized industries, laws and art and literature and so forth, and a period of relative peace as this unified Han dynasty was established. They also had religious belief in a sort of a quest for immortality, and also, like the ancient Egyptians, an interest in preserving especially elite bodies in special tombs made of a kind of wood that actually suppressed the decaying of a human body. So one famous example of this comes from the grave of Lady Di. Lady Di, and you can actually see the original person from over 2,000 years ago, still pretty well preserved in the lower right there. I could have given you a larger picture, but I give you a smaller picture. Look it up if you want to see a more close-up image of this woman. So Lady Di was a noble of the Han dynasty. She died later in life. She ate a lavish diet. She had heart disease and clogged arteries, and she clearly ate rich food. She was buried in this really elaborate tomb, partly constructed of a kind of wood that kept her body from decomposing. So I'm not going to ask you a lot of detailed questions about Lady Di on the exam, but she's a very interesting example of Han culture's social hierarchy. Okay, so just to summarize our discussion of ancient China, I'm not going to ask you to remember all the different societies we discussed, but you should know that like other ancient civilizations, it's really important that ancient China had domesticated crops and agriculture focused on these river valleys, millet being domesticated in the Yellow River region, rice along the Yangtze. We see large centers and evidence of social hierarchy in graves by the 4th and 3rd millennium before the Common Era. We see state development by really just like 1,000 years later, by the end of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. There is some evidence for emerging writing by 6500 BCE, which is really early. And then it's more uniform across China by the Qin dynasty, and the Qin emperor was really interested in standardizing writing and so forth. We see a tradition of shaman kings, which will be similar to what we will find later in Mesoamerica. And then some of these ancient societies, the Shang are well recognized archaeologically, but some of the early societies, such as the Xia, we don't really know them archaeologically. Some of this stuff is actually known from a written historical text from the historian Quan, written over 2,000 years ago. So ancient China, very interesting examples of early complex society.